name's Ruth. I'm a lecturer in the French department here at Bristol, which is part of the School of Modern Languages. And within the French department, I teach African literature and cultural history.
My name is Madhu Krishnan, and I'm a lecturer in the English department here at the University of Bristol. And I teach primarily African literature and culture, although my job title's more broadly in post-colonial writing. We're going to today talk about literature and pre-colonial African history.
We thought it would be a good way into this topic to introduce a couple of the books that we love and that we teach, and to think about how contemporary African writers engage with African history, in particular with what's sometimes described as pre-colonial African history, and some of the kinds of hero figures that come out in the novels that we teach and that we enjoy reading. So we want to share these with you.
The first book that I wanted to talk about isn't really contemporary as such, and it's a book that I think a lot of people who watch this video may have heard of, and it's Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. I have my rather old copy that I've had since I was 17 years old, so I don't think you can get this exact edition. And Things Fall Apart, for those who aren't familiar with it, was published in 1958 by William Heinemann, and it later on in 1962 became the first novel to be published in the African Writers series. And while it wasn't actually the first African novel in English to be published in Britain, it has become by far the most significant and the most sort of influential. And I guess I just wanted to read the opening paragraphs because I think they're very telling about what Achebe does in terms of representing a pre-colonial African history in its own terms. So the novel starts. Okonkwo was well known throughout the 9 villages and even beyond. His fame rested on solid personal achievements. As a young man of 18, he had brought honor to his village by throwing Amalinze the cat. Amalinze was the great wrestler who for 7 years was unbeaten, from Umuofia to Mbaino. He was called the cat because his back would never touch the earth. It was this man that Okonkwo threw in a fight which the old men agreed was one of the fiercest since the founder of their town engaged a spirit of the wild for 7 days and 7 nights. The drums beat and the flutes sang and the spectators held their breath. Amalinze was a wily craftsman, but Okonkwo was as slippery as a fish in water. Every nerve and every muscle stood out on their arms, on their backs and their thighs, and one almost heard them stretching to breaking point. In the end, Okonkwo threw the cat. That was many years ago. 20 years or more, and during this time, Okonkwo's fame had grown like a bushfire in Harmattan. So I just think it's kind of interesting what Achebe is doing there in terms of how he recenters Igbo culture and Umuofia as a civilization unto itself. And I think in terms of textuality, there's a lot to be said about how he marries kind of techniques taken from oral storytelling with modernist aesthetic practices. But to me, what kind of strikes me even more are the ways in which he immediately develops this kind of story in which his frame of reference is pre-colonial African society. Like, I really like that last simile, right? His fame had grown like a bushfire in the Harmattan. And because, you know, it's something where, well, this is a reference point unto itself. We don't need to talk about this in reference to English weather or something that we'd understand, or, you know, like the drums and the flute singing. It's like, well, this isn't just noise, it's a language system, it's a system that's highly organized, it's a social system that functioned for all its imperfections unto itself. And I think in a lot of ways, to me, that's what's really exciting about what the novel does.
That it's in a sense teaching its readers some things, but it's also breathing new life, new forms of expression into the telling of African history, of a pre-colonial frame of reference. Yeah, and I think that you said about oral tradition as well feeds into the book that I'm going to talk about, which is a recent book from 2005, and this book is called Pokou, Concerto pour un sacrifice, which translates, and there is an English translation available, it translates as Queen Pokou, Concerto for a Sacrifice. And it's by a writer from the Ivory Coast called Veronique Tadger, who is still writing today. And what she does in this novel is retell the story of Queen Pokou, And Queen Pokou was the founder of the Baule people. She was an Ashanti princess in the 18th century. She was a member of a powerful family descended from a noble lineage, and when her uncle died, there was a power vacuum and she was seen as a threat, and for that reason she had to flee the Ashanti kingdom, and she had to cross the Comoé River when she was fleeing. And when she got to the Comoé River, she was told that in order for her to cross that river with her followers, she wasn't travelling on her own, she would need to sacrifice her child. She would have to throw her child into that river in order to be able to cross over. And according to the legend, to the founding myth, that's what she did. There are different versions of what happened after she threw her child into the river, but according to legend, a group of hippopotamuses rose up and the people were able to cross over the river and thereby find a new place to call home. So this is a really important legend in the Ivory Coast, and it's one which in this very short text, Véronique Tadjo retells it in 5 different ways. So she gives us the first version, which is kind of the stripped back facts that I've just given to you, but then in the different parts she twists the story slightly. She gives us the story from a different perspective. So we get, for example, a version in which the myth is overturned, and we get Queen Pokou refusing to sacrifice her child. What are the consequences of that? She then gets captured and with her child gets sold into transatlantic slavery. Okay, so this enables Tadji to show us a whole different branch of history. We have another version where Pokou throws her child into the river, and then we get a sense of her kind of inner sadness and suffering as a woman. So she kind of humanises that national founding myth in a different way, in a different light. So we get a retelling of a national myth, but 5 different tellings within the same story. So I think that's quite interesting in terms of thinking about what literature does when it comes into contact with history, and reminding us that history is a process of storytelling, which is very powerful, which wields different kinds of power. And I think, and Tadji says this in her introduction, that she's aware of the ways in which this story has been used to support certain kinds of nationalist causes, which can be very divisive. If you have a single story, if you have a monolithic story, then that can be a very powerful thing, but it can also be something which is very divisive. And of course, we can think about kinds of founding stories that get pushed in Britain, okay, or in France, or in the United States.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So was Pokou a historical figure, or is it primarily from tradition? Is it primarily like the legend from tradition, or was there an actual living person by that name?
There was an actual living person, but most of what we know about her has come down through oral traditions. So we know that she was the niece of Osei Tutu I. So we know that she was related to the Ashanti kings. So we know that she lived, you can look at a Wikipedia page, she lived in the first half of the 18th century, but we don't know the exact dates.
I was also interested in, you said that she's seen as kind of the founder of the Baole people, and that this is something that's become quite important in the Ivory Coast more broadly. So is there a way in which the story has been adopted by other ethnic groups or other pre-colonial nations, or is it quite specific to that context?
That's a good question. I mean, it's a kind of popular myth, a national myth which has moved beyond the Baole people in the sense that it's now present in the national imaginary, and part of the reason for that is that Houphouët-Boigny, the president of Ivory Coast following the independence, is one of the longest running presidents in sub-Saharan Africa, was himself Baole. And so you have a monument of Reine Pokou, of Queen Pokou, in Abidjan. There are also other versions of the story that exist. There's a cartoon film version that came out a couple of years ago. It's a popular story. But as Tadji says in the book, she remembers learning this story at school and learning it by rote, learning it by memory. And what she's encouraging us to do, and her readers to do in this book, is to think about how we retell stories, and remembering that we need to have agency. We need to remember that how we tell our stories is as important as the story itself, and it's kind of bare facts.
I think that's really interesting, yeah, and I think that ties to some of what interests me about what Achebe does in terms of how he actually narrativizes the story that he's telling. And I think, you know, one of the things that always comes up when I teach Things Fall Apart is the fact that the society in Umuofia is seen as highly multi-directional or highly complicated. You know, it's not just a case of glorifying a pre-colonial past. There's a sense of the imperfections in society. But there's also a sense that, well, this is a society that had its own way of telling its stories and of functioning. And, you know, the ending of the novel is very much, I think, a commentary on what happens when those multiple ways of telling stories and seeing things are suddenly stripped away and you only get to have the one kind of authentic story or authentic history. So I think that's quite interesting. The other book that I brought, which is not likely to be as familiar to our students, would be Jennifer Nansibuga Makumbi's novel Kintu, and it's also quite new. It was published in 2014 by the Nairobi-based Kwani Trust. And I guess what I find interesting is that, much like the novel that you're talking about, Kintu takes its title from a kind of legendary founding figure. In Ganda tradition, Kintu is the first human, the first man who falls from the sky. And it's something that would be well known really to anybody with a familiarity with Ganda culture. And it is very much a popular story and a popular legend, and there are later figures known as Kintu who have existed, but you know, I don't think there's any historical evidence of a real Kintu, but I don't think that changes the importance of the story in Ganda tradition. And what I think is interesting in this book is that Makumbi actually doesn't make reference to that creation story in any explicit way. What she tells the story of is the Kintu family, beginning in 1750 and going all the way to 2004. So to me, there's something quite interesting about how, for a reader who knows about Gandan culture and society of tradition, it instantly signals something, which I think does weave its way through the book and the story and what it's doing, but that's not something that's so easily identifiable by other people, and I think that that question of address to me is quite interesting. And I think as well, you know, one of the things about this novel, which has led to a lot of sort of critical commentary, is the fact that while it covers nearly 300 years, I mean, it's a historical epic, a multi-generational historical epic, there is almost zero mention of colonialism. There are kind of allusions to the fact that the nation-state of Uganda is founded. There are allusions to the various regimes. There's one character who, while we don't see it happen, is described as having returned from a trip to England, I believe for educational purposes. But really, the entire colonial moment isn't the center of this at all. And to me, I find that really interesting in relation to Tadjo's novel, just thinking about historiography. Because here, it seems to me that what Kintu's doing is historicizing African culture, if we can say that in such broad terms, in such a way that it's no longer always about colonialism and always about Europe as the center, and it's actually re-centering indigenous and pre-colonial societies and traditions and histories as having their own temporality and as having their own kind of legitimacy.
Yeah, and that's clearly important and for us to bear in mind when we're thinking about labels like pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, is that they all take as their common reference point the colonial moment, which, if we think of a timeline of African history, an African history which is recoverable going back at least 5,000 years, the colonial moment is a very small parenthesis right at the end of that timeline. And I think we need to bear that in mind. And for me, as a teacher of literature, reading literary texts offers a way of kind of humanising and linking into how that history has been told and continues to be told and retold today, but from alternative perspectives.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that there's something about the way in which literature almost seems to free us from the one directionality of historical narrative that allows that. I mean, for instance, you couldn't have a history book that tells the same story 5 different ways. You know, you couldn't have a history book that places its emphasis in such sort of flexible ways, not in the same way that you can with literature. And I think, you know, there's something about saying that maybe even moving beyond the single story, that we don't even need to think in those terms anymore, is quite interesting to me.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So how important do you think are hero figures in these sorts of texts?
Well, I think Pokou is a very ambiguous hero figure. You know, at some points in the novel, she's a kind of feminist hero. She's someone who is standing up as a mother for the rights of her child. At other moments, she's a power-hungry tyrant, you know, who is quite willing to sacrifice her child. So I think Tajo is throwing light on the kinds of limitations that hero narratives might create. You know, on the one hand, heroes and role models are so important, especially within a narrative of resistance. But on the other hand, you can't allow these things to settle, to become congealed, to become kind of monolithic stories. And she's saying we need to keep, you know, going back to these stories and thinking about what they mean to us now in the present moment. Yeah, I don't know what you think about heroes.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I think, I mean, to me, one of the things that's quite interesting with what literature does is play with that idea of what's a hero. I mean, to go back to Achebe, which is such a foundational text for Anglophone African literature. You know, Okonkwo is a hero figure, but he is a deeply flawed hero figure. And he is a hero figure who, ultimately, in many ways, we are not really being asked to sympathize with, at least not fully or uncritically. And I find that really interesting, the idea that though he is placed at the center of this novel and that it is a tragedy and that we do in various ways empathize with him, the kind of flaws of his hero status are made very plain, and also the kind of dangers, I think, of a kind of uncritical hero worship in that sense.
Yeah.
And for me, a novel like Kintu is quite interesting because there isn't really a hero figure in it. I mean, it's playing, obviously, through its title with this mythic hero figure, but it's actually about a society, it's about Ganda society, it's about a family, it's about a kind of long historical sweep in which it's more than the heroic, which is foregrounded. It's really the kind of everyday situations that occur. And I find that really interesting, because to me there's actually something that perhaps ironically is heroic about revising the script in that way, to kind of try to reconstitute a history that we so often don't think about, or is in so many ways silenced.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. The kind of lived experience of history as being something social, and not just about key individuals, great men or great women.